Hi, my name is Chris Melnick, and I'm a realtor in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Have you ever seen an older home that's completely renovated? Yes, you probably have. Now, have you ever thought to yourself about whether or not it was properly permitted? No, you probably haven't. Well, that's good because those renovations probably didn't have permits, even if they were legally required to. Today, I'm going to talk about permits in regards to renovations in Halifax, Nova Scotia. But permits in renovations is a giant gray area in Canada in general. Now, as a disclaimer, I will say you should always get permits whenever they are required. But before I begin, if you don't know about me, one of my past projects was a home I completely redid in Ontario, including the entire electrical system, entire plumbing system, making an addition and doing everything mostly myself, including framing, drywalling, windows, doors, roofing, etc., all permitted and inspected. I'm likely one of the only realtors in Atlantic Canada and possibly the country who can say that. And I've been involved in construction and renovations for quite some time, so I have a very good understanding of how things really work. First, the basics. What do you actually need permits for in Halifax? Now, this is straight from the source. What work requires a permit? All structural repairs or alterations, all interior and exterior renovations with a value in excess of $5,000. Additions, including decks, exterior stairs, and sunrooms. Any change to a plumbing system, and the demolition of existing structures. And then there's electrical. Interestingly enough, an electrical permit is completely different from a building permit, which also includes plumbing. For electrical, they say, anyone who wants to install a new electrical installation or modify an existing electrical installation, and anyone installing communication cables in non-residential applications. So if you're following the rules to a T, if you're getting new kitchen cabinets and a counter that probably cost more than $5,000, you should be getting a permit. And if you're changing a normal light switch to a dimmer switch, you should be getting a permit. But is everybody doing that? Absolutely not. In reality, people usually only get permits for more major, expensive jobs that are easily visible. This would be like adding an addition, garage, enlarging windows, replacing a foundation, etc. Why? This is for a couple of reasons. First, if the budget for a job is big and the timeline long, and the cost of the permit and time for the inspections is minimal relative to the rest of the project. Next, if it's a big, noticeable, expensive job that isn't permitted and it gets reported, there is the possibility that the whole project must be taken down. Now we'll talk about whether or not you should be concerned about work that wasn't permitted. Now, this would depend on the type of work done. Was it, number one, done properly to current standards? Number two, done properly to past standards? Or number three, just done improperly to any standards? The difference between past and current standards is important because building standards are always improving. But older properties that were built to old codes are not forced to come up to current standards if no work is being done. All the old features of that old home are deemed to be grandfathered in, even if they don't meet current standards. Now back to the first scenario. If the work was done properly to current standards by qualified professionals and not permitted for whatever reason, then in terms of safety and quality, there's probably not much of a concern. The only real concern if it was unpermitted is that if someone reports it, it's noticeable from the outside because building inspectors aren't allowed in your home without your permission, and it can be proven that you recently did it. In that case, the building inspector could make you get a permit after the fact, and will probably get you to take down parts of it so that they can inspect some of the key components. A building inspector in Ontario that I used to know would say, we don't get them to take down all of it, just a third. And that's assuming, though, it was done properly. And at the end of the day, if you're going to do it properly anyways, you might as well get a permit to begin with. So you're not paying for the job, then to remove a third, and then put it back. Now for the second scenario. Now, the second scenario is if the work was done properly to past standards. I see this often with non-GFCI receptacles around the kitchen sink. Now, decades ago, this used to be code, and it was considered completely safe. But new codes came into place, and new work is to be done by those new standards. Yet, fairly often, a newly renovated kitchen in an older home will have new non-GFCI receptacles around the kitchen sink. And even home inspectors will mostly shrug and say, well, that was code when it was built. So even though it was obvious that the receptacle is new, it's shrugged off as something that kind of could be grandfathered in. Another one is new decks that are on deck blocks and patio stones. This was what was done even in the early 2000s. Current code requires either concrete sonotube footings or screw piles which go beneath the frost line to prevent frost heaving. But extremely often, new replacement decks are still just built the old way, and of course not getting permitted. And realistically, if this were ever pointed out to the city, the owner could probably just claim that it's an older deck, and thus should be grandfathered in. Now, if they were caught while they were building it, then it would be a different conversation though. But again, at the end of the day, it would be just as safe as the old deck, just not safer. And that's why many people and many home inspectors are okay with it. There's also another factor which adds to this ambiguity of when permitting is necessary. And that's because most of the time, repairs are perfectly fine and acceptable without being permitted, because you're just fixing something rather than changing it or adding to it. So back to the deck example, on a brand new unpermitted deck, someone could just claim that they're only replacing the deck boards and not the structure, and thus probably could get out of trouble even if the city were to find out and come after them. Because the city would have to prove that it's a new deck, which they probably wouldn't bother spending their time on. As long as the owner doesn't admit that it's a new deck, they're probably fine. The city doesn't have the resources to launch a CSI-style investigation as to whether or not a deck is new. Finally, there's the scenario of the work being done improperly. Now, in this case, a home inspector would probably point it out because it was never proper at any point in time, so no one could claim that it should be grandfathered in. There's no plausible deniability. That said, many people are still okay with these homes if it looks decent and is kind of functional, and that's up to them. There are a ton of these homes in the North End and Fairview. So we have a few takeaways. The first is that if you are absolutely keen on only buying a home that was properly permitted for all work, then your only realistic options are to buy a new home or almost new home that had no work done on it. Effectively, every older home has had work by the city's definition that should have been permitted, but wasn't. Even on the property disclosure statement, if the seller claims all the work that was done has permits, they usually don't know what required permits in the first place and just say yes. If you're curious about the renovations on a home you're interested in, you could call planning and development to ask if they had permits, but they take up to 10 business days to get back to you, which is not helpful in today's market. The second takeaway is that if you want to be realistic about buying a resale home, just be aware of these gray areas and be open to accept work that was done properly to today's or past standards. even if they were unpermitted. Yes, it's against the rules, but that's just how things work in Canada. It's a bit like speeding. If you wanted to know officially how fast you can drive on the roads, the official answer is up to the speed limit. But in reality, everyone drives about 10 kilometers an hour more than that, including police officers. It's just the way it is. I've known renovation contractors who have been in the business for 30 plus years who have never gotten a permit. It's just the way it is. In Toronto, there are multi-million-dollar homes that are completely gutted and redone without a single permit. And bars aren't concerned, banks aren't concerned, and insurance companies aren't concerned. It's just reality. As always, I hope you got some value from this video. If you'd like my help buying or selling, please contact me. My contact information is in the description. And remember, officially, you should be getting permits whenever they are required. Goodbye.